Welcome to Mini Potbelly Stoves by Rhonda Creations. Thank you for being here. Okay, I'm working on a little potbelly stove. I don't know if it's going to work out, but here's what I've got so far. I've taken this tube of paper that I made, which is just a roll of cardstock rolled around into this shape. And then I put strips of copy paper just to make ribs, then cut out the windows. I put some linen thread around to look like the door, and now I'm just sealing it off by putting it on a piece of chipboard cereal box container, food box, and then letting that dry. Then I've also made 2 layers thick of chipboard, just a platform to set that on, and then to give it a lip, this is 4 layers thick, the second set down. And now I'm going to work on attaching the little feet. I'm going to thicken these up with wood glue once I get them attached to the platform. And then I've also been making this little platform. So I think I'll probably raise, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with this, but anyway, I'm making this. This is just some 1/4 inch, 2 thicknesses of the cereal box container or food container, and then I'm closing it off to make it into a platform itself. So I may set the whole thing on this. I'm not sure if I'll even use that piece, but right now this is what I'm working on, and I'm gonna give it some feet, like I said, and go from there. So the rest of this footage is sped up. So just gonna add the glue to attach the feet, and just eyeballing where to put them in the corners. And I'm just using a craft glue here. And I'm also using my phone camera for the majority of these clips that I've put together. I apologize for the auto focusing constantly. My hand is in the way. I'm still learning how to get good footage of my hands. If you have any tips, I'd appreciate those. Just setting that aside to dry. And then once it was dry, I took the glue, the wood glue now, and I'm just coating each side of the leg to thicken it up. Because wood glue dries like all glues dry, but wood glue maintains a shape. So I'm trying to put enough on there that it bubbles up a little bit and is held by the surface tension on the edge, and then it'll dry. And I realized, once I set that aside, I realized, oh, I can add glue to all the legs right now. So grabbed it and started adding more glue. And then I did set it on my Post-it note just in case it weeped glue onto the surface. I didn't want to glue the whole thing to the surface. So back to the stove itself, I took a sewing pin and I'm going to make a handle for the fake door here. And just taking some pliers and bending that pin into a 90-degree angle, but you'll see I'm going to have to bend it again. So the hole was slightly too small for me to comfortably press the pin through, so I grabbed another pin and just wiggled it around to increase the size of the hole. because I don't want to push in the side of that paper tube, the side of the stove. So just using glue to set it in place, because I don't realize yet that I need to pop the pin out a little further. Once I got it in there, then I saw, oh, the handle is way too close to the stove itself. So then I popped it back out and gave it another bend. You see it's got sort of a Z-shaped bend now, so that the handle pops toward the person that wants to open the stove. And then just putting a little dab of glue there so it'll dry in place and not wiggle around and pull out. Now I got to thinking about the stove and putting lights in the stove, so I had cut a hole in the bottom of the stove part, but then when I consider it's going to set on this stand, I didn't really want to cut a hole in the stand. I didn't really know how good I would be at doing that, honestly. So I come up with a solution later. But first, I'm going to work on a small shovel. This shovel is for removing ash from the stove. You'll see there'll be a compartment. That base, I'm going to build a small compartment where the ash would collect. And then this little shovel can be used to remove it. Now, we had a shovel like this growing up, and I remember looking at it because it was made from a single piece of metal. There were no connection points, and that was intriguing to me. So it had been stamped out and folded into shape. And so I'm actually emulating that design here on this piece of paper. I've scored the edge of the shovel, and then I'm pushing the edges up. Just scored it with the back of a X-Acto knife. And here I'm putting a small clip where the handle will bend up. And here, because of that bend, I wanted to put a small piece of cardboard to protect that bend and keep it from bending so many times that it tore apart. So that's what that is. It was not, there was no such piece of metal on the inspiration piece. I'm just adding that for my own peace of mind. I'm just taking a look at how the shovel behaves. Now I had drawn lines for the edge. I had scored it. And here I'm holding the ruler against it and pushing it up with the back of my tweezers. And this was in the original, the shovel that I'm using for my inspiration piece. It was folded back like this. And the handle on that one, as I remember, it was more rounded than this one that I'm making, but the concept is similar. I'm using the bone folder to just, smooth down those folds. Nothing better than a bone folder. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend getting one. If you're going to be working with paper, it's going to be a very useful tool. And trimmed it off, although I'm going to trim it again later because it's a little bit long still. And I'm dealing with that crimp. So see, my fingernails are holding the edge of the cardboard and crimping it as the slight bend of the shovel takes form. And that was also part of the inspiration piece, probably the most exciting part of it. Here I'm just adding some glue to the edges so they don't fray apart. This chipboard like this is comprised of a few layers, and I also like the slight rounded effect that the dried glue gives when I add this. And then I added it in the valley there where I had scored the edge of the shovel, and just moving on to gluing the handle down. The original inspiration piece did not have any such glue or welding or anything. It was just bent into shape. But like I said, in this case, I'm using some glue. And then found a way to set it aside so it didn't get stuck to my desk. Back to the little platform that the stove will set upon. I finished that small platform and it unfortunately fits right inside the large platform. So I don't know exactly, but I'm going to continue on making the edges to the large platform here. And these are just 1/4 inch pieces of that chipboard material, and I'm just running glue along the edge and placing it in place, just building a small box here. And it's very fiddly. It's so small. My fingers want to push everything out of the way. So I use the small tools, like the tweezer and my ruler and stuff, to move everything into place. And then I'm just putting a little more glue because I had removed the piece. I hadn't gotten it exactly on the edge, and now I got it closer to the edge. I'm happier with that one. And those tails that are hanging off, I am going to trim those, but I'm going to wait till everything dries because the pressure of my scissors will probably pull everything out of alignment that I've put. And here's an interesting problem that I had. I did measure, but apparently cut this incorrectly. So I actually had to splice another piece of the chipboard back on. And here I'm adding a little brace. I had put braces, one on the front, one on the back, to hold that splice together while the glue was drying, because I had cut that piece too short, even though I'd measured. So, measure twice, cut once. Luckily, these aren't expensive materials. So I just keep testing and trimming off a tiny piece and testing again. Happy with the fit, so just adding the glue here. To the very edge, and also the ends, because I want the corners to stick together. And then going to place that on the edge. See how fiddly it is. And then I went ahead and reinforced the seams on the inside with a little bit of the glue and cut off those tails. Set this aside to dry completely before I put the lid, but eventually I will add that lid. Oh, I guess in the sped up footage, I am going to add that lid now. Glued that on. And I placed a little bottle of paint on top to weight it down. And what I should have done is put a brace inside because that piece bows considerably, but I kind of hide it with the actual stove itself. I'm not sure if you can see it. Some of the views you can see the bow, but I'm moving on, turning that little box on the base into the ash collection area. So that little piece that I'm adding looks like a vented piece where you would move one piece of the metal and it would reveal little holes. So that's what that is supposed to emulate. And it's just more chipboard with little teeny tiny pieces of chipboard glued on. I'm just trying to center it there and scraping off excess glue. Now that top piece is still drying, so you're going to see that gives me a little bit of problem here in a second while I'm trying to add the handle. Now this handle is made from the rest of that pin that I had used to make the handle for the door on the stove itself. So just using my pin drill, and I actually drilled the exact seam of the piece itself. So see how here where I've shown what I've done. So what I'm doing is as I push in, it's pushing in the piece of cardboard. So I've placed a piece of cardboard in there as a brace and then regluing. The brace does not remain. I was attempting to place the handle, getting impatient basically in my build. When things start getting exciting, it's very difficult to remain patient. And at this point, I had figured I could use one of those tiny tot staples as my handle. Also, you see it there, but like I said, that is the rest of that sewing pin. So I'm just gonna accept what the universe has told me, set it aside and let it dry and work on something else. So I decided the top of the stove needed to look more perfectly round. So I took these punched out pieces of paper. They happen to be very, very close to the size of the stove itself. So I'm just going to go with it. Those are from a standard 1¼ inch. I think it's a 1½ inch punch. And I did do 2 layers and weighted that down to dry before I added it here to the top of the stove. And then I'm going to add a little connection point where the chimney pipe comes out. So that's what this little piece is. This is a small, I think that's a 1/2 inch. Yes, that's a 1/2 inch circle. And again, that's 2 layers. And the pipe itself is just printer or computer paper just rolled into a pipe shape. And I just rolled it until I was happy with the thickness of the pipe. And I don't know if you noticed while I was gluing, I didn't get a perfectly flat end, but it didn't matter. I could kind of hide it with the glue. So now that this is dry, I can actually drill into it again without separating the top. Keep an eye out for that bowed top. You can see it there. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's very obvious. So I'm just trying to place the fiddly, teeny tiny little handle. And then once you get it placed, try to move it around and get that other one put in there. But I kept pushing in the one side, so I had to use my tweezers to straighten up the handle, make it look like it's a real handle, not one side isn't pushed in further than the other. And I was happy with the way this turned out. I kept looking at it, deciding, well, how far should the handle stick out? I wasn't sure. I was so happy with it. It was starting to come together. Just taking another dry fit look at it. I was dealing kind of with that bow and also dealing with the fact that the lights on the inside of the stove, I'm not going to be able to put lights up through the bottom. So thinking about that. And then I moved on to painting that base piece black. Which really did bring it to life, honestly. Seeing the piece, and I kept keeping that little platform. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but I don't know if you noticed there in the very background, there's another black cylinder, and that is the beginning build of a second smaller, there it is, stove. And this one is made from a, you know, what is that called? A spool of thread. I had found that in my sewing box. I went digging for that pin and I had seen that and it had just stuck in my mind. And so as I was working, I realized, you know what, that I could make that into a tiny potbelly stove. So here I'm coloring the windows. I put some windows in and I colored with that orange marker so it looks like flames, because I do plan to hopefully put a light down in there, but I realized, like I said, I'm not going to be able to use the bottom. So I've cut that flap off the bottom and I cut a seam into the edge there, and I'm pointing out. I'm not going to be able to cut through the bottom. You'll see I painted around the windows first, and that was done before I put the plastic windows in place. Back to the little shovel. I'm going to paint that one too while I've got the paint out. Glue is dry. The shape is set on that thing. So just painted everything I can and then set it aside to dry some more. And this was a black spool of thread, but the base is made from chipboard, 6 little pieces of chipboard, and then that square base and the same type of stovepipe. It's just a quilled piece of computer paper. And the handle that you saw me painting there was just a length of toothpick. And here I decided that the handle of the shovel needed a hole, and I had trimmed it down. Get paint in the hole. Oh, here I'm going to try some dry brushing with that gray paint, but I decided it was far too stark. I wanted it to be a little less stark. I didn't mind the gray, but I didn't want it all to be that stark. So I went ahead and went with some brown and just doing some dry brushing on these pieces and I was much happier with the brown. So just went all around, dry brushing. And I had taken the spool and I knocked the handle off here quickly. So I'm using the X-Acto knife to rough up the piece on the spool where the handle attaches and just reattaching that little length of toothpick. And I had taken just craft glue and drew a door and a couple of swirly marks and just as decor on that tiny stove. And that's what I'm dry brushing, trying to bring out that detail on there. It is hard to see, but hopefully I get a right angle that you can see with the lighting. And here I'm finally attaching the stove to the base. Covering up my mistake of that bowed top. And there we go. 2 little stoves. And the next thing I was going to make to go along with the shovel, I thought once I shovel some ashes out, what am I going to do with them? I've got to put them in a bucket to carry them out of the house. So this is a small ash bucket or a coal bucket, and just making it in a quick, took a length of cardstock, cut it using arced lines so it's a part of a circle, and then I can curl it around on itself like this. I'm trimming where it attaches, and you see I had drawn the part where it became the pour spout of the bucket, and then I had trimmed away. That's what that pencil mark was in the beginning. So the top of the bucket does not have a straight line all around. It does have a small pour spout. And here just attaching the bucket into its circular shape. And going to clip it to dry. Set it aside to dry. And took this opportunity to add a little glue to that seam so that it's not so stark once that glue dries. And once it was dry, I removed the, first I added the little holes where I'm going to put a handle, and just using this sharp pointed tool. Any sharp pointed tool would do, or you could even drill a hole if you've got one of those little drills, and just tried to put them exactly opposite each other because it's going to hold a handle, like I said. And then I set it aside to dry. And once it was dry, I added glue to the bottom edge like you see me doing, and just set it on another piece of cardstock, the same cardstock. And that's just plain old scrapbook cardstock. And just reinforcing that seam on the inside. And this is the handle. I'm using this cotton thread that I got from Hobby Lobby. And I'm going to stiffen it with some glue. And that's what you see me doing here. I've already cut a length and just running it through the glue on my fingers. And then I'm going to bend it into an arc on the table and let it dry into that shape. And I kind of try to move it around just a little bit so that it doesn't stick to the table. Now, once the bucket is dry, I just cut away the excess cardstock and sand the edge of the bucket till I'm happy with the smoothness of it. And then I moved on to this handle made from stiffened thread. First thing I noticed was the hole was too small. So I just, in a very unprofessional fashion, just shoved the tool in there a little bit further and made the hole a little bigger. And did that on both sides. And then I ran the thread through using my tweezers to help me get it pulled through here. And I just wanted to do a quick test to see, okay, finally got it pulled through. How big is the handle gonna be? I didn't know if I needed to cut any off, and I actually did not cut any off. And you'll see what I did. I used the length of the thread to come back up and attach to itself again, and I just glued it back to itself. So it creates a loop that goes through the edge of the bucket, and then just clipped where I had added the glue and let that dry. Do both sides. That one side was kind of fiddly. Finally got it. I did not want to glue it to the bucket itself because I want the handle to be able to move. So here I'm doing the wiggle test, and it passes the test. And also the looks like the shovel will fit. So I'm going to go on with painting. And you'll notice in my thumbnail, it looks like there's ashes or something in the bucket, and it is. That is actually the stuff inside of the Do Not Eat silica pouch. There was actually some black pieces. I don't know if that's charcoal or what that is, or if it's more silica, but it looks like ashes. So I've been in the process of gluing it in place because I don't want it to go everywhere. Thank you so much for watching the Potbelly Stoves.